next up, we have transforming access to legislation, which, to be honest with you, is one of the reasons I volunteered to do this session, because I heard from Andy Neal last year. So I'm quite interested in take two of that. So PCO's vision has been to take the Parliamentary Council office. Vision has been to make the New Zealand legislation website the single point of access for all law published in Aotearoa. This website redevelopment is a major step forward and reshapes how people find, understand and use legislation. Their approach reflects the Govis 2026 focus on courage, collaboration and innovation, and they're going to share practical insights from the redevelopment, how they decided decentralised approach was the best way forward, how they brought about legislative changes to enable that, how they collaborated with 100 plus agencies, how they managed risk, large-scale content migration, design for accessibility, introduced an API, and other driven designs.
Done a lot of stuff.
You have done a lot of stuff, and I'm going to introduce you both now. So I've got Thomasin Sleigh as the Kaiwhakahaere Tuihono Hongere, who's the online channel manager at the PCO. So Thomasin led the project to improve access to secondary legislation and reimagine more broadly how people interact with and find legislation in Aotearoa. She drove the discovery, design, testing and build of the new New Zealand legislation website, ensuring it delivered a modern, intuitive and accessible experience across devices. Her mix of design, digital delivery and user-centred expertise shaped a platform that now better supports democracy and everyday mahi across Aotearoa. And we have Zinal Bhadra, and she is the Kaiārahi Umanga, agency lead for PCO's project to create a single point of access for all legislation in Aotearoa. She works closely with more than 100 agencies that publish secondary legislation supporting uplift and metadata and publishing practices. Her background spans digital content, leadership, customer experience, UX and accessibility. Looking forward to this.
Kia ora. Thanks so much, Bill. Ahi Marie, everyone. We're in the afternoon of the second day of the conference. I hope everyone's prefrontal lobe is doing okay. Sorry, something. I'm not touching anything. Is that happening without me touching it? Can I go back?
Go back.
Oh, all our secrets are being revealed. Oh, here we go. Hang on. Oh. There we go. Okay, cool. So I will use this. Yes, so we're very excited to be here to share with you. That's not me.
Are we doing something?
Are we doing? Am I
I
touching?
do like that it said a silent cry for help.
Yeah.
At the top while that was happening.
I don't know if I should touch anything or should just leave it to do its thing. I'm going to press back. Oh, okay. Let's start there. Hopefully it just stays there. We're very excited to be here to share our project with you, where we've got to. There's a lot of really interesting connections about what we're going to talk about today with that threads in the conference. So we're hoping to kind of tease some of those out today as well. But Bill gave us a great introduction, so we'll just kick straight into it.
Sounds good.
We're going to spice things up with some chat about secondary legislation after lunch. So we'll start with a little bit of interaction. If everyone could put up your hand if you feel like you basically know what secondary legislation is. A few hands? Keep your hand up if you have used secondary legislation in your professional life or your personal life. A few more hands still. And keep it up if you found that piece of secondary legislation on a government or a non-government website online. So a couple of hands still up. Okay, very interesting, thank you. I asked those questions to kind of introduce the kind of problem that PCO was seeking to resolve. So secondary legislation has been identified as a bit of a gap in the legislative ecosystem in New Zealand. There wasn't a good sense of how much of it was being made, where it was being published, the quality of the drafting, the quality of the metadata that sat around secondary legislation. And so the goal of our project has been to make that content more easy for New Zealanders to find. And we've really taken a decentralised approach to this work, a collaborative approach, and one that's grounded on a set of shared standards across the government sector. So a lot of kind of points that have been raised in the kōrero and the hui that we've been having together with you all. But just to backtrack before we get into the nuts and bolts of it. Secondary legislation is a relatively new term, so don't feel bad if you didn't put your hand up when I asked if you kind of basically knew what it was. It's had a lot of different names over the years. It's been called statutory regulations, legislative instruments. For a while on the New Zealand legislation website, it was called other instruments. But secondary legislation, to give you a definition, is law that has been made by someone other than Parliament. So it's made under a power that Parliament has formally delegated in an act. And there are many types of secondary legislation, so rules, regulations, orders and councils, notices, all different kinds of instruments. Conversely, primary legislation is an act that is made by Parliament. So just to give you a couple of examples of secondary leg, so the Licensed Building Practitioner Rules 2007 are secondary legislation. Section 535 of the Building Act empowers the Minister for Building and Construction to make these rules, and they basically set out how people can become licensed builders and retain their licenses and that kind of thing. Similarly, anglers' notices, where you can fish, what kind of fish you can fish for, how you can do that fishing, they are all secondary legislation that are administered by Fish and Game New Zealand. So I'm going to click this and hopefully ta-da. So secondary legislation is drafted and created by the Parliamentary Counsel Office, the drafters of legislation, but it is also written and published by over 100 government and non-government organisations who are empowered to publish this material. It's published on a myriad of different websites, drafted in many different ways. It often looks very similar to guidance, and its kind of status as law is quite unclear. And as a member of the public, it's very tricky to access this information and get a coherent sense of its relationship to primary legislation. So, as I said, the goal of our project was to make secondary legislation more accessible to New Zealand and to pull out some of the threads that have been talked about over the last couple of days, take quite a system-wide view and also kind of a stewardship approach. So not to be a central repository, but to work collaboratively to make this content available to New Zealanders. A little bit of background.
Transition, smooth.
Transition.
So PCO's top priority has been to improve access to all legislation, including secondary legislation. So a few years ago, PCO worked really closely with all the agencies to identify which provisions within their primary legislation empowered them to create legislation. Secondary legislation. And through that work, we identified that there were about 8,000 to 20,000 items of secondary legislation out at large. So naturally, there were a lot of questions for us at the PCO to work through. How many items of secondary legislation were really out there? Who was publishing them? How were they publishing it? Where are they publishing it? And could the New Zealand legislation website be the portal for all legislation, including primary and secondary legislation? And how do we make those relationships? Like, how do we connect the primary legislation to its secondary legislation? I don't know who's clicking.
A ghost in the machine. A little bit of background. Someone in a previous talk was like, do a woohoo for history, and this is the woohoo. And we gave this presentation to some younger staff members, Kaimahi at PCO, and they were shocked by the fact that when the legislation website was first launched in 2008, it replaced the paper-based model of getting access to legislation. No longer did you have to go to the library or to Bennett's bookstore to get a piece of legislation that was rapidly becoming out of date as soon as you got it. It was an absolute game changer in the way public could access the law that applied to them. There has been some work on the PCO to change the website to make secondary legislation more accessible via this portal. There was a set of information added in 2012 called Other Instruments. These were just simply links to the legislation published by organisations not PCO on the site, and it relied on agencies letting us know what was happening with their secondary legislation. There was some more clarity in 2021 when the Secondary Legislation Act was published. It provided more certainty as to what counts as secondary legislation. And behind all this has been extensive research in the PCO about what acts empower secondary leg, where the empowering provisions sit. And as a result, in 2022, the Secondary Legislation tab was added. It identified empowering provisions in the primary acts and made that data more relational between the secondary leg and the primary legislation. But as we were conceptualizing the project, it became clearer to us that the website wasn't fit for purpose for the scale of change that we were proposing. So we decided to not only deliver the new secondary legislation search service, but also to redevelop the legislation website alongside of that. So a reminder of the old legislation website. This is where we started, with a lot of agency-published secondary legislation and all different websites all over the internet. We realised that this was a first-of-a-kind project. We had very little international kind of counterparts or models that we could emulate. We kickstarted and began with a partnership with our vendor Boost, so connecting to the corridor of working with local vendors, Boost based on Victoria Street. They're our web development and data aggregation partners. We kicked off an agile process with sprints, retros, all those good things in the agile iterative model. We decided to use a tool called Supplejack to gather the data related to secondary legislation. So this is a tool that was actually developed in the National Library for the National Library's collections. It's an open source data aggregation tool that was going to be a core part of our technology stack. We also kicked off with a lot of user-centered design, so making sure that users were involved in the project from the get-go and throughout. What do people need? What were the pain points in the user experience? What could we learn from that? And really interestingly, looking at the shape of the PCO legislation data, what possibilities did we have to add value? Pia actually said in her talk yesterday, if you provide access to legislation, why don't you provide access to the legislative data that sits behind that? And we've been excited to deliver a new API as part of this project as well. And shout out to Catalyst, who also are here, making sure accessibility was from ground zero. We did several accessibility audits throughout the project at different milestones to ensure that the website was easy to use for people using assistive technologies and other devices. So our development phases were to build a proof of concept and then deliver the pilot. So the project that Z and I are talking about were to deliver the pilot secondary legislation service alongside the redeveloped website. And we're now moving into the operational delivery as well. So it's been quite good timing in this presentation. We're kind of wrapping up the pilot phase and moving into the operational project as we speak. So there's no rest for the wicked, is there, Z? So Z is going to talk about the secondary legislation.
Ta-da! Okay. So every major project has a journey. Ours just happened to have over 9,000 pieces of secondary legislation, an unhealthy attachment to spreadsheets, and a few existential moments along the way. Looking back, we think that we somewhat followed the hero's journey. Now, before we begin, it's worth understanding the landscape we were navigating. Let me set the scene for you for how secondary legislation existed before the single point of access became reality. Right, okay. So by now we know that secondary legislation existed everywhere and nowhere, so there was no central inventory. But we had estimates of how much stock was out there. So through the research we did a few years ago with the agencies, we knew that there were about 8,000 to 20,000 items out there. We just needed to find them. So that research had produced a holy grail, a spreadsheet of sorts, and that became our go-to document for everything and every step of the way in this project. And the closest thing we had to the map of unexplored legislative landscape. So we started combing through agency websites to find these missing pieces of secondary legislation, and we found them in mysterious locations. We found them in PDF libraries, we found them on archived pages under corporate publications, within search results, and places we still completely don't understand why. We also learned really quickly that secondary legislation varied greatly in content, format, length, and complexity. It could be as small as half a page or as big as 1,500 pages, as is the case with Electricity Industry Participation Code. And SL secondary legislation was not just regulations, came in many different types, orders in councils, exemptions, approvals, determination, fees, codes of practice, you name it. So we thought that we should start meeting the agencies from the get-go and get to know from them how much they understood of their own publication practices and of their own stock of secondary legislation. And while all of this was happening, we were also trying to make the legislative changes necessary to the Legislation Act 2019 to enable the single point of access. Thanks, Ghost Fairy, for clicking the slides. So what was the plan? How were we planning to gather legislation from across 100 different websites? Our plan was simple: let technology do the heavy lifting. We used the same data collection tool called Supplejack that Tom introduced you a few minutes ago. And how does Supplejack work? Well, it visits the given URLs on the agency websites. It collects secondary legislation and brings it into our database and powers the search through the legislation website. After all, in 2023, we'd successfully run a proof of concept, and we knew this could be done. In 2023, we collected data from 20 agencies and brought it into a demo website. This time around, the challenge was much larger. Instead of 20 agencies, we needed data from all agencies. And instead of a proof of concept, we needed a fully operational pilot by March 2026. So in theory, this was all beautifully simple. In practice, however, that's a whole different story. So when Supplejack visits a given URL, how does it know that it's found secondary legislation? Well, it doesn't. It's a tool. So it parses the full text and looks for empowering provisions. Now, empowering provisions are sections within Primary Act that authorize creation of secondary legislation. Here's an example of an empowering provision and what it looks like. Supplejack is taught to look for this information in certain predictable or recognizable syntax. As soon as it comes across words such as under Section X of ABC Act 2020 or pursuant to Section X of ABC Act 2020, it knows to read that information as empowering provision. And then it matches that information against the data that we hold in our Holy Grail, the master spreadsheet I spoke about a few minutes ago. In this example, Section 7 of the Election Access Fund Act 2020 is an empowering provision. It authorizes creation of a notice, which is a type of secondary legislation. This is an example of an actual notice that is made under Section 7 of the Election Access Fund Act 2020. The red boxes highlight the information that Supplejack was able to find and match it to the data we hold. Now, that's exactly the kind of outcome we were hoping for. Technology identifying a piece of secondary legislation, matching it back to the primary legislation under which it was made, with minimal manual effort. This is what a matched item looks like on the legislation website. The gray box on the left highlights that this is matched and by which agency this piece of legislation was created. The links here connect it back to the primary legislation this was made under, and the blue button at the bottom takes you back to the source of publication. This is an example of what an unmatched item of secondary legislation looks like on the website, on the legislation website. But an unsuccessful match doesn't automatically mean that this is not secondary legislation. It could simply mean that instrument doesn't reference the empowering provision in a way that Supplejack is able to recognize it. Or maybe that information is missing altogether, so there is nothing to match it against. In other words, a failed match wasn't necessarily a failed result. It just meant that technology had reached its limit and a human needed to take a closer look. So yes, in theory, it sounds very simple. Technology does its thing, but the problems arrived quickly, and there were many problems. In the essence of time, we'll just look at the top 3 problems and how we solved them. PDF publishing was our topmost problem. Most legislation existed only in PDFs, and Supplejack would need to parse the text to look for empowering provisions. Now, many of these PDFs only existed in images and were unreadable by Supplejack. So here's where our clever developers at Boost come in. A big shout out to them. So they developed a solution to OCR these images as part of our normal workflow, so that Supplejack could read the text that was in the documents and get to the information about empowering provision. The second biggest problem was not knowing what was in force and what wasn't. Agency websites often didn't clearly distinguish legislation that was in force versus legislation that was expired or revoked. And when version information was unavailable, we had to make some pragmatic decisions very early on in the project. When that information was unavailable, we decided we'll label all legislation as in force unless there was clear evidence that it was revoked or expired. And the third problem was that of the problem of metadata. We know by now that agency publishing practices varied greatly, and there was no one-size-fits-all solution. This example highlights why poor metadata was one of our biggest challenges. MedSafe is one of the biggest producers of secondary legislation. It has over 3,500 items of secondary legislation, all of which are, by the way, available through our website. Sounds great until you take a closer look. You can see every single list, every single item on this page has exactly the same title. That raises an obvious question. If everything has the same title, how do you tell one piece of legislation apart from the other? And these 3,500 items are now available on our legislation website with all the same titles. How do you filter, sort, or make any meaningful conclusions when you're wading through so many results? So how were we going to push the system-wide changes we needed? It became clear that technology alone wasn't going to solve the problem. We needed active engagement, training, and development of agencies. We needed agencies with us on the journey, hand in hand. So we ran more than 100 training sessions, webinars, drop-in sessions, and one-on-one meetings. Every conversation uncovered another exception or an edge case. That was a standing joke in the team. There are more exceptions than anything. We had created a list of technical specifications and guidance to help agencies improve their publication practices. And we opened them up for consultation. We got loads of feedback, and we genuinely implemented that feedback because we really wanted agencies to be able to work with these technical specifications and apply it to their publication practices. And in the subsequent versions of the specifications that we published, we genuinely implemented the feedback and made meaningful changes that made compliance easy. On 8th March this year, the new legislation website went live. Today, we have over 9,000 items of secondary legislation. This number is growing from the time I made this presentation. However, this service is still a pilot. We've demonstrated that this can be done, but the pilot has highlighted something really important. Until we have consistent publication practices across agencies, there will remain data gaps and inconsistencies. And thanks to all the things we've learned in this phase, we've planned a significant pivot for the operational delivery of the next phase, which Tom will tell you more about shortly.
Thanks, Steve. So alongside the secondary legislation work, things disappeared, that Z's talked about, a concurrent path in the project was the more fuller redevelopment of the Ledge website itself. And there were some key that Chris talked about as well this morning in our work to deliver this new website. One was mobile experience, so optimizing for mobile. A key part was accessibility, as I mentioned before, improving the accessibility of the website for people and using assistive technologies or had other accessibility requirements. The PCO has a digitization project, so a program of digitizing old acts and other pieces of legislation. So we wanted to incorporate this content into the new website, which wasn't present on the old website. The secondary ledge stuff that Z has talked about, and then also I mentioned we wanted to improve the programmatic access to legislative data and deliver new data services to New Zealanders. Connected to peers kind of question that she asked about in her session yesterday as well. So we've been excited to deliver a V0 of our API as part of the pilot and the release of the new website too. This is what the new website looks like. So remembering where we started from to where we got to, we made a lot of changes, so I'll just kind of highlight a few in the interest of time. One key piece was the new contents pane here on the left of the website. Early discovery and a lot of our user testing and discussions highlighted to us that users wanted improved navigability and kind of stickiness of various elements on the page so they could understand where they were in legislation. So delivery of the contents pane was a key piece in that puzzle. And there are other kind of key pieces where it was a little scattering of applause, yay for the contents pane. And other kind of stickiness bits across the top that go with you down the page, and then other kind of basic things like a back to top. So just kind of a fewer kind of UX improvements there on the main legislation page. We've kind of got a totally different search experience, which I won't go into too much detail about, but we wanted to fundamentally return more results. So there were some parameters around the quick search on the old website which weren't immediately obvious to users. So we wanted more feedback, more search query feedback about why your results were looking the way that they were. So fundamentally, we have more results being returned, but we introduced the facets on the left-hand side to allow you to filter those results a little bit more quickly to get to what you needed to get to. Facets were very complicated because all of the criteria for the different types of legislation don't apply to all the different types. So it was pretty, again, hat tip to Boost for figuring a bunch of that stuff out for us. And then I wanted to show you also just quickly what the agency published secondary leg looks like in the search results. So you can see here agency published secondary legislation with PCO published legislation, and then so that's how it looks when you are in a search a search results page. Noting, of course, that not only returning the metadata, but the key thing here is also the full text of the legislation itself is in the search index, so people can search on the content as well. Just quickly, making things look good for mobile is very hard. Nick, our designer at Boost, worked really hard to incorporate all the elements, the new features we were designing, and make sure that they worked on all different screen sizes. We had a phased release, so connecting to points that people have made previously at the content in the hui. We wanted to take small bite-sized pieces, deliver frequently. We had a closed beta for a select group of users. We had an open beta with a login, an open beta without a login. Then we launched the new website, and we moved the old website to classic.legislation.gov.nz. Kind of risk mitigation approach. We wanted to give users more time to transition if they needed to. Also acknowledging the importance of the website for society in New Zealand generally. This was just a kind of backup if we needed it, and so people can still use the old website. It also allowed us to get a lot more feedback at launch, so we could build some new features. And section view has been one of the ones that we've delivered recently, which came back really strongly as a user need when we launched the new website. What we learned a lot of stuff. We did a lot of stuff, we learned a lot of stuff. Couple of quick learnings. The login for the public beta was a huge barrier. No one wanted to log in, no one wanted to create a password, no one wanted to do that. It didn't allow us to test the website against sort of realistic levels of traffic. Richard, one of our amazing developers at Boost, tried to share what he'd been working on with his mum when we launched the public beta, and she was like, I'm not logging in. I was like, oh, a bit rude. Anyway. It was a challenge to get a kind of cohesive view from agencies. The type of work that we're doing, people on the agency side, there were lots of different groups working on it. So we had kind of web content managers, lawyers, all different types of people. So sometimes it was hard to get a kind of cohesive view and direction from agencies. Every product manager will know users are helpful and honest and contradictory. Just on that section view feature, for example, it never came through very strongly in all of our testing and all the beta releases as a strong user need until we launched the website, and then it came through as 85% of people said that's what they needed on the website. So yeah, things come through at different stages, and you always need to be ready to respond to them. The large ledge really needs its specialised UX treatment. So if you print the Income Tax Act off 2007, it would be 9 reams of paper stacked on top of one another. It's a very hard document to put on the internet. And we kind of treated some of the large ledge as the same thing in the corpus of legislation that we were working with, but actually I think it really needs its special treatment to make it navigable and usable.
2 minutes.
Agencies are busy. They support the kaupapa, but they're busy. That's come up in the conference before. The balance of comms is hard because we wanted to give agencies and publishers of secondary ledge a really clear idea of where we're heading and our direction of travel, but we were also building the plane. We were making legislative changes. Sometimes it meant we couldn't give definite information. The web specs that Z showed us before is a set of requirements for agencies. They're still interim web specs, so there was always this ongoing kind of tightrope of what we could say, definite information versus kind of this is generally where we're going and we want to give you a heads up kind of thing. But fundamentally, what we learned, and it's been very validating coming to the conference and discussing this with everybody here, because there's a lot of learnings that we have had that I've seen kind of repeated and duplicated in other projects. We needed the pilot really to map and research and understand this very craggy landscape of agency-published secondary ledge. We knew it was complicated, but we didn't kind of know quite how complicated it was. And we also really needed the pilot to help us bring agencies with us on our hero's journey. So connecting to, I believe his name was Patrick, who was here on yesterday talking from Ministry of Health. And he talked about not needing the data to be perfect, but releasing what you have, doing what's good enough and then demonstrating the value through that way. And that's very much what we've done with the pilot. The data is pretty low quality, to be honest. But we have figured out through that process that we need a more robust method in order to gather very structured metadata for the operational service. And we've quickly pivoted and are implementing this new model, which is not only the method of gathering the data, but changes to our technical design as well. And we also, as Z said, we really wanted our engagement to be meaningful with agencies, and we need to make the publishing requirements for secondary ledge simpler and easier for them. So we've used the pilot to meaningfully get that feedback in order to change the way the harvesting model really works. So we've really attempted to pick up again on some of the themes of the conference to take a really system-wide collaborative view. The model that we're proposing to improve this access is very decentralised, so agencies are still responsible for their secondary ledge and will be responsible for bringing the data together and making it accessible for New Zealanders. And we're getting there. The pilot is delivered, the new website is out there, the new data sets are out there, but we do continue our hero's journey to find the elixir of the single point of access. So thanks very much for listening.